woman enjoying retirement after a lifetime of hard work.
My mother did very well for herself. She was a very strong-willed woman.
Nina was quirky. I can't tell you how much she loved frogs and Elvis Presley and country music. She just marched to her own drum and did her thing.
Found brutally murdered in her home.
He stabbed her 24 times.
There was blood throughout the house.
It's like living in a bad horror movie.
A dangerous predator eludes police.
She had been sexually assaulted. Our victim potentially knew who the suspect was.
I kept asking them, is this going to be a cold case? And they kept telling me, we're not done yet.
DNA evidence leads to a shocking realization.
It was a match to another murder.
The thought that we had a serial killer here in town scared the hell out of me.
And a suspect no one saw coming.
To call this an unexpected killer is an understatement.
That's like every person's nightmare.
It hit me like a ton of bricks.
Kansas City is a large metropolitan area on the border between Kansas and Missouri.
Kansas City can be a very fun place to be. We love our sports in this city. It's a very friendly place to live.
Nothing seems out of the ordinary on October 29th, 2010, until Kansas City police receive a 911 call about a woman found unresponsive in her home.
A woman called police and said she discovered her mother at the bottom of the basement stairs, and she checked her for vital signs and found she was dead.
When the first officer arrives on the scene, the caller leads them to her 75-year-old mother, Nina Whitney.
I showed them my mother's body laying at the bottom of the stairs. I told the police officers I believe she had just dropped over from a heart attack. And then I called my cousin Kim.
The phone rang and I picked it up, and Paige told me my mother is dead. Paige said she thought maybe Aunt Nina fell down the stairs going to the garage.
While Paige speaks with her cousin on the phone, police take a closer look at Nina's body.
Nina was face down, and there was a shelving unit there with a bunch of glass frogs, and a lot of those frogs had fallen off the shelf on top of her. It initially looks like an accident and a natural death, but when they rolled the victim over, they discovered several stab wounds in her chest. And also, what were determined were defensive wounds on her hands, which is something that we see when someone fights back.
Clearly, this is no accident, and detectives arrive to begin a homicide investigation.
When someone's stabbed like the victim was, it usually means there's some sort of emotion tied there because you're actually stabbing someone instead of just shooting them or something like that. Her blouse had been pulled up, and there were buttons missing. And they quickly discovered that there what they believed to be saliva on her breast, which they swabbed. So it felt like this was sort of a sexual in nature homicide.
Police inform Paige that her mother has been murdered.
I don't think I've ever been that stunned in my entire life. It's so surreal. It's like living in a bad horror movie. I don't know how to describe it. You're just totally and completely stunned.
A lifelong native of the Midwest, Nina Whitney was a woman with humble roots.
My mother was born in South Dakota, and then their family wound up here in Kansas City in the late 40s, early 50s. My mother had a very rough life. My mom's mom left their family, so my mom was left to take care of her younger siblings. She married my father, and my parents divorced when I was about 9 years old. My father left her pretty much destitute, so it was just the two of us. And we struggled tremendously. My mother worked some very hard jobs, and we lived on food stamps.
Eventually, Nina found a stable, well-paying career.
She worked on the assembly line at General Motors here in Kansas City. She managed to buy a house, and she did very well for herself. She was a very strong-willed woman.
Nina wanted a better life for her daughter and encouraged Paige to get an education.
I went into criminal justice at Central Missouri State University, and I was a probation parole officer for 25 years. The older I became, the closer my mother and I became. We spent a tremendous amount of time together. My mother started collecting frogs back in the mid-70s. Ceramic, glass, dishes, clothes, bedding, towels. The entire house was filled, wall to wall, floor to ceiling, with frogs.
Nina's favorite hobby earned her the nickname the Frog Lady.
Nina was quirky. I can't tell you how much she loved frogs and Elvis Presley and country music. She just marched to her own drum and did her thing.
Investigators are stunned that someone would viciously attack this 75-year-old woman in her home.
I was in total shock, truly. She was in her house, minding her own business, not doing anything wrong. Like, how on earth did that happen?
When I found out Nina had been killed, I couldn't imagine who could have done this. I had no ideas.
Detectives interview Paige to narrow down when the murder might have taken place.
Friday, about 6:45, I decided to call my mother to see what time she wanted to go shopping on Saturday. And that's when she didn't answer the phone. It was extremely unusual for her not to answer the phone. So then I called the cell phone, and she didn't answer that either. Then I started to panic. So then I took off and went out south toward her house. And when I got to her house, the porch light was not on, and I knew something was very wrong. So I walked through to the kitchen, and it was dark. So I turned the light on, and there was her body laying at the bottom of the stairs. And I could feel the back of her head, and her head was ice cold. And I called 911, and then it just kind of hit me out of the blue that I was hearing weird noises. So I followed the noise upstairs to the hall bathroom. Both faucets in the tub were running full blast. And I thought, well, that's just really strange, because my mother didn't use that bathroom.
Detectives wonder if Nina's killer had turned on the faucets, and if so, why?
The victim's daughter had located the guest bathroom bathtub faucets running, and she had turned those faucets off. So the bathroom was processed for fingerprints and DNA.
In the victim's bedroom, there was like an imprint of where it looked like somebody had been laying on the comforter.
And near the bed, we could see buttons that appeared to be similar to the victim's blouse, as well as a hair roller that was similar to the hair rollers in the victim's hair. So that led us to believe that the victim was assaulted, and maybe her blouse may have been torn open at that location.
As every corner of the house is searched for evidence, investigators make a crucial discovery.
We opened up the knife drawer in the kitchen and located a paring knife where the blade was bent and there was blood at the base of the blade near the handle. That could mean that somebody had tried to wipe it clean.
Forensics bag the knife for further analysis and process the house with luminol, which can indicate the presence of blood.
The luminol tells us that somebody was moving around in that house with some amount of blood on them. We got that blue glow in the victim's bedroom, bathroom, hallway, living room, and the kitchen.
The front door was unlocked, and we didn't find any sign of forced entry, which was a big clue for us that our victim potentially knew who the suspect was.
There's no reason for anyone to hurt her. And my mother was not a very social person at all. She had no family other than me here in town that would be in and out of the house.
Paige points to one detail detectives could not have determined from their search.
There was a shelf by the front door where her cell phone always was, so she could take it when she went out the front door, and it was missing.
Had the killer snatched Nina's cell phone? Police request a trace on it, while officers go door to door looking for witnesses.
One of my other detectives found a party down the street that had seen a white male in the neighborhood earlier that day. He was in his 50s, walking with a limp. The witness saw him go to a black Jeep. He saw that car was parked kind of behind the house, about a block away. And so he sees this guy walking and kind of looking around. And so he just kind of mentally noted it. He kind of looked like he was probably up to no good.
Could the suspicious man be Nina Whitney's killer? As they start to track him down, detectives catch a break.
We found that Nina's phone was still on and still being used in South Kansas City. We were able to do surveillance and observe the person using our victim's cell phone.
Coming up, a break in the case reveals a potential serial killer.
We had another homicide.
There were zip ties that have been used for bindings.
He's terrorized an entire community.
And a grieving daughter takes matters into her own hands.
I did feel a need to help them investigate my mother's homicide.
If she didn't get the answers, then she kept asking.
In my gut, I just knew that was him.
Detectives investigating the vicious stabbing of 75-year-old Nina Whitney believe the killer stole her cell phone. Now, police have traced the phone to an address in South Kansas City and rush to apprehend the suspect.
We did kick his door in, and when we took the suspect into custody, we found that he had the phone on his person.
The suspect goes by the nickname Lil Mickey. Police demand to know how he came into possession of a murdered woman's cell phone.
He told us he was walking down the street pretty close to our victim's house and found that phone laying in the grass. He said he didn't make the most money in the world and was just glad to have a cell phone that was working and started using the cell phone.
Skeptical of his story, investigators ask him if he killed Nina Whitney.
Little Mickey adamantly denied being involved in any sort of violence with our victim or anything where someone was harmed or killed. We asked him, could you have bought this phone off somebody else? Did you get it from a person?
Despite hours of questioning, Lil Mickey stands by his story.
His story was, I found the phone there in the grass and picked it up.
Police want to know his whereabouts at the time of the murder.
Based on her lights being off in the house, we believe Nina's murder happened during daylight hours. And he did provide an alibi, a female that he had been with that day.
Investigators have no grounds to detain Lil Mickey any longer, but they obtain a sample of his DNA just in case.
He wouldn't seem like he would have a motive to commit this type of crime, but we still had to do our due diligence.
The next day, police tracked down the woman he used as his alibi.
So we talked to her. The information she was able to provide, it matched up with what he had been saying.
With Lil Mickey looking unlikely as the killer, detectives turn back to the theory that Nina knew her attacker.
It was obvious that she had let someone in the house because there was absolutely no forced entry.
We had to look at Nina's history and try to figure out who she would have let into the house. And we also had the witness that had seen a white male in the neighborhood. My supervisor thought the composite sketch would be a good thing to pursue in this case. The witness willingly came down to police headquarters and met with our sketch artist. She sat with him and gave a pretty good-looking composite sketch of what he believed the party looked like that he saw that day. We showed Paige that picture, and she looked at it for a long time, but didn't necessarily jog her memory about who it could possibly be.
The individual did not look familiar to me at all. I could not for the life of me think of anyone who fit that description.
Investigators can't be certain if the man seen by Nina's neighbor is the killer. But with few quality leads, police decide to release the sketch to the media.
I was the publisher and editor of the Cass County Democrat-Missourian. We all know that police sketches are an unexact science. However, I think they can be very useful. So we had run the sketch in the newspaper to put that sketch out to a larger audience.
As the sketch goes public, detectives work with Paige to come up with a list of people that Nina would have had a reason to let in to her home.
She'd had quite a bit of work done on the house in the last year or so there had been lots of people in and out working on the house.
Maybe someone that is a predator did work inside her house and decided that she would be a good victim. Paige went back into Nina's home and went through all of her records to show us dates and times when she had stuff done at her house.
The detectives got all that information from me and questioned everyone who had been in and out of that house.
My squad started working to collect DNA from anyone that we thought had contact with Nina. And I think we collected about 40 to 50 samples. Honestly, most people were willing to provide their DNA to us when we explained that this was an elderly woman that was brutally murdered. If there was someone that maybe we thought was fishy or involved or could potentially be the suspect, DNA is good to rule people out in cases like this.
The forensics lab will compare the scores of samples to the DNA recovered from Nina's body.
It'd be nice as a detective to get DNA results like they do on TV, 5 seconds later. But it was about a month after the homicide when we got our results back. My boss called me and she said that we had a DNA hit. So I thought that, well, if there's a DNA hit, then we'll be able to find a suspect. But that wasn't the case because it was unknown DNA.
The DNA does not match the dozens of samples collected by homicide investigators.
Everything from the mailman to Little Mickey to contractors that had been inside her house. It rules them out, absolutely. But the DNA profile that was found was a match to another murder almost 2 years to the day in Harrisonville, Missouri. So we knew at that point that this was not the first time that this suspect did this. And that wasn't something I expected. It was a big deal. What concerned us was that we did have a serial killer type situation.
One month after the murder of Nina Whitney, DNA taken from the crime scene as matched to another homicide in the national database.
It was a match to another unsolved murder in Harrisonville, Missouri. It's a smaller town, about an hour south of Kansas City. Kara Jo Roberts was found inside her home in the bathtub, shot in the head with the bathtub running, just like Nina. It seemed like a sexually motivated homicide, and with the tub running, that matches Nina at our scene.
Police decide to keep this explosive new information under wraps.
At that point, we were trying to keep this information close to the chest because the suspect didn't know that we knew both crime scenes were connected. We did not want that in the public.
Detectives even withhold this new development from the victims' loved ones, including Paige.
I kept asking them, when is this going to be a cold case? And they kept telling me, well, not yet. We're not done yet. And I don't know what they were doing, but I know they were doing things behind the scenes.
Investigators head to Harrisonville to get briefed on the Kara Jo Roberts case.
Just reading through a case file doesn't give you the whole story. So to talk to an investigator that actually worked that case, it helps paint a better picture of what happened in the other investigation.
I was one of the detectives from Kansas City at the time that was sent to work on this case. Kara Jo and her husband lived right there in the small town. They had a kid. It seemed like a very happy relationship. Just your normal, happy family.
The Roberts family was devastated by a horrific tragedy on November 5th, 2008.
Her husband found Kara in the bathroom. She wasn't wearing any clothes. There were obvious gunshot injuries. She was in the bathtub, and the bathtub was running. There were zip ties that we speculated at the time had been used for bindings.
At the Kara Jo Roberts scene, we found 2 different white-colored zip ties that appear to have been used but cut. We also found a roll of duct tape. On both the zip ties and the duct tape, we had male DNA.
There was DNA found on Kara's body, and there was indications given by the medical examiner that she had been sexually assaulted.
Detectives investigating Nina's murder ask for a rundown of the suspects in Kara Jo's case.
Based on the fact of no forced entry, very much kind of angled towards us believing that the husband may have had something to do with this. A domestic violence type homicide is usually spur of the moment, rage and kind of action, but this could have been a situation where he was trying to control her physically with the bindings, and then it escalated.
Kara Jo's husband claimed he found his wife dead when he got home from work and immediately called 911.
From the time she was last seen to the time when her husband came home and found her was a very tight window. It was only like 45 minutes. Her husband gave what was kind of a complex alibi, but when we went to talk to his friends who were involved in that alibi, they were able to corroborate everything.
DNA testing at the time also cleared Kara Jo's husband, and no other viable suspects were identified. The investigation went cold until the DNA connection to Nina Whitney's murder revives the case 2 years later.
Nina's homicide was a lifeline to the Kara Jo Roberts case. We have double information, and we have a bigger picture of what's going on in both of these acts.
What we have to do at that point is start doing what's called victimology. You basically have to understand the circle of Kara Jo's world, and you look at the circle of Nina's world. You know these two cases are linked, and you want to find those commonalities in between.
What was really interesting was all the stuff in the Kara Jo Roberts case that matched up to Nina's case. As far as the tub running, we had a lot of different theories, but our main one was if our suspect was going to commit a rape, they would want to use that tub to wash away evidence after the act. In Nina's case, he turns on the water to try to maybe get her body up into the bathtub. He may have not been able to drag her body up those stairs. Our witness down the street sees this guy walking with a limp, and we thought the limp may have hindered him from getting her body back up to the tub. So just like our case, the Kara Jo Roberts case had someone down the street that saw someone in the neighborhood.
The witness had seen a Jeep, had seen a male going to the Jeep, and that male may have been limping.
And it looked like they were up to no good.
Despite the telling parallels, police can't find anyone connected to both Nina and Kara Jo.
That was not the answer that we wanted as detectives, because that meant that it was somebody totally random. A random person coming in and taking their life. That's like every person's nightmare.
In a case like this, where you know there's a suspect out there that could do this again, it makes it even more urgent to try to catch the person. So you're grasping at straws, looking for any leads, any information, any help you can get to try to solve a case like this.
You can only work with what information you've got coming in. There wasn't any new information coming in at that point.
Running out of options, detectives turn to the one person who might be able to connect the two victims.
Detective Blank called me, and he said, "Paige, I have something to tell you." And what he told me was more horrifying than my mother's homicide. That scared the hell out of me.
Detectives investigating the stabbing death of Nina Whitney have informed her daughter Paige about a stunning development.
Detective Blank told me that there was a DNA match from the saliva they found on my mother's shirt to DNA that they found on Kara Roberts in Harrisonville. Kara had been raped, put in the bathtub, and then shot in the back of the head. The thought that we had a serial killer here in town is enough to cause panic for every female in this city.
We provided information from both crime scenes to Paige. And that's not something we would normally tell our victim's daughter. But in this case, Paige was a probation and parole officer. She is savvy in law enforcement, so we thought we could trust her with that information. We wanted to see if anything in her memory would be jogged to try to figure out if there's any common people, common locations that both victims would have known or gone to.
At the time, I thought it had to be someone who targeted my mother specifically. But when they showed me the evidence in Kara's case, there's just a million things to think about when you're trying to come up with a profile for someone like that.
There wasn't much there that seemed to be connected between the two victims. There wasn't an aha moment in that meeting at all.
It's been 5 months since the murder of Nina Whitney, and investigators are desperate for a break. They turn back to the composite sketch of the man with the limp seen close to Nina's house.
I wasn't necessarily a believer in the composite sketch thing. People make their own determination on whether they think the information they have is valuable to a case. They see that sketch and they decide, well, this guy's got glasses and the guy I know doesn't have glasses. And so the danger in that is that that person may have information, but that person may be turned off by the sketch.
We had run the sketch in the newspaper, but really that sketch hadn't brought in a lot of leads.
Despite their reservations, police hope that more people will see the sketch on billboards around the city, and someone will identify the suspect.
They were able to put that picture along 71 Highway, along with our tips hotline. The number of tips that we received on this case based on that sketch were not as numerous as you would think. All of them have to be followed up on, because there could be something there that you're gonna miss if you don't take those tips seriously.
Weeks pass as investigators chase down leads that go nowhere. The lack of progress takes a heavy toll on Nina's family.
I was really angry that she died in her own home in that terror and that panic. helpless and alone and fighting for her life.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week, I think about my mother's last few minutes of life. I know the neighbor was home next door and nobody heard my mother screaming. I wake up to the sound of her screaming 2, 3 o'clock every morning. It doesn't go away. It does not go away.
There's nothing worse than having to tell a family member, I'm sorry, there's no new information coming in, because they're frustrated. They're of the mindset that, why aren't you out there doing something?
At her wit's end, Paige summons the strength she learned from Nina growing up and takes it upon herself to search for the killer.
The investigation was not moving fast enough to make me happy, so I did feel a need to help them investigate my mother's homicide. I drove around the city and went to every antique shop, every flea market, every thrift store I could think of where she liked to shop.
She was looking for that white male walking with a limp and that black Jeep. And Paige was seeing black Jeeps like that everywhere.
I would take pictures of all the cars that looked like black Jeeps and all the license plates on those vehicles and forwarded all of those to the detectives.
Paige made it her job to be involved, and if she didn't get the answers, then she kept asking.
I can't even explain to you how badly I needed to know who murdered my mother.
Despite Paige's efforts, 6 months after her mother's death, the investigation starts to go cold.
Those kind of unsolved cases in Kansas City leave an entire metro area on edge. As the days turn into weeks and weeks turn into months, how do you keep that case alive within the pages of your newspaper? Most of our weekly papers did not include an update because there was nothing to update in the case.
And I kept thinking, this is going to be a cold case. I'm never going to figure it out. I'm never going to figure it out.
You always hope for them to get information to catch a suspect quickly, but I just couldn't fathom who would have done it. I had no suspects in mind.
I drove around and took pictures of the billboards because I wanted to make sure I got pictures of them before they had taken them down. But the sketch concerned me because I don't know if that description was accurate. I thought there's just so many questions that I will never have answers to.
Suddenly, 1 month later, Paige has a realization.
May 26th, 2011, I was driving down 71 highway in rush hour traffic, and I just happened to glance up and look at the lower half of the billboard. And I swear to you, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Like lightning had come out of the sky and hit me in the head. It literally all fell into place as I'm driving down the highway.
Seven months after the murder of Nina Whitney, her daughter Paige has just been struck by a mind-blowing realization.
I was driving down 71 highway, and I just happened to glance up at the billboard. Prior to that, when they showed me the sketch, the individual did not look familiar to me at all. I just focused on the lower half of his face and the chin, and it just an epiphany. It was Jeff. Jeff Moreland was a boyfriend that I had for 3 years while we were in college. We met in 1983 at Central Missouri State University, had a relationship for 3 years. Jeff and I met in a criminal justice class. He was as sweet and charming and funny as he could possibly be, and I truly fell head over heels in love with him. Once I got my graduate degree, I became a social worker, and Jeff went on to become a police officer. He loved being a police officer. That was his ideal dream job.
Paige and Jeff broke up after 3 years of dating, much to her mother's dismay.
My mother absolutely adored him. For years after we dated, my mother told me she wished I had married him. I know if he showed up on the doorstep, she would happily let him in the house.
Could Paige's ex-boyfriend from 2 decades prior really be the sadistic serial killer detectives have been hunting for?
I was so lost in my own head, trying to tell myself that Jeff didn't do it. I kept trying to tell myself that I was wrong, but in my gut, I just knew that was him. At the parole office, I'd mentioned it to a couple of the girls that I work with, and they told me that I should run him through the system. I said, well, that makes sense. So I ran Jeff through the system. And lo and behold, if he didn't have a black Jeep Wrangler registered in his name. And I nearly lost my cookies. And I also found out Jeff had been a police officer in the Grandview Police Department, but Jeff had retired about 5 years prior to my mother's homicide because he'd had Parkinson's.
Does the Parkinson's diagnosis mean Paige's ex could be the man with a limp spotted near Nina's home? Paige brings her findings to detectives.
I told him that Jeff had been a police officer in Grandview and gave him all the information that I had.
Officers look up Jeff Moreland's home address and discover he lives in the same small town as the first murder victim, Kara Jo Roberts.
He lived in Harrisonville, Missouri. So that was the first person during our investigation that matched all of those factors.
Detective Blank said, yep, it could be him.
Detectives know they have to take extra care when investigating an ex-cop.
Harrisonville is a very small community, and Detective Blank told me that Jeff knew every law enforcement officer in the county and that he would find out that he was under investigation.
Investigators decide a direct approach is the best option.
We did not believe that we had probable cause at that point to get a search warrant to get his DNA. So we went down and knocked on his front door. I did tell him, your name's come up in a homicide, and we need to get a DNA sample from you. If someone were to tell me that, I'd be like, what homicide are you talking about? That was not Mr. Moreland's reaction. He said, well, I've got to go take my cat to the vet. And he went back inside his house. My gut was telling me that we had our guy, but you need to be sure that this is your guy before you go with your gut.
Police again ask Jeff to provide a voluntary DNA sample.
I ended up calling him and telling him again that, hey, we need your DNA to compare to this homicide, and then we'll be done.
Jeff again claims that he's too busy to provide a sample. A week later, investigators receive an unexpected phone call from the police department Jeff retired from, located just outside Kansas City.
So the sergeant with Grandview Police Department calls us and says that he's been in contact with Jeff Moreland and he provided him a DNA sample. We rushed down there and we made contact with the sergeant. On his desk, he had a pill bottle.
The sergeant provides a strange account of how he obtained Jeff's DNA.
Jeff told him that, I want you to meet me at this gas station along 71 Highway. And Jeff shows up in his black Jeep. And Jeff tells him that Kansas City has come and accused him of being involved in a murder. As he's explaining the story, he takes swabs and puts them in his mouth, and then Jeff hands him this bottle along with my card and says, here, give this to the detectives. We tell the sergeant, that sample's not gonna work. You can't just provide your own sample. And the sergeant sort of indicated, well, we'll just get rid of it in the trash then. We told him, no, we'll take that bottle off his hands and take that from him.
The evidentiary value of this stuff is just worthless. But obviously, we recover it and we examine it.
That DNA was tested, and it did not match our homicide.
The fact that that DNA came back as not a match just didn't surprise me at all. Had he followed protocol, that would have exonerated him. And he very easily could have done that, but he chose not to.
We more and more really thought that we might have had our suspect based on his actions at that point. We all know about serial killers. I was worried that the suspect was going to do this act again.
A few days later, detectives get the call they've been dreading.
I received a phone call. There was a rape that occurred in Harrisonville. But the victim was able to get away, and then she was able to contact police. The victim took the officers to where this event had occurred the day before. It was Jeff Moreland's residence. So my first question is, where's Moreland at now?
When police go to arrest Jeff, he's nowhere to be found.
Detective Blank told me Jeff may have raped a third victim, and he is now on the run. I didn't know if he would be after me. I didn't know if maybe he had figured out that it was me who initially contacted the police. That was a nightmare.
former police officer Jeff Moreland is the prime suspect in the murders of Kara Jo Roberts and Nina Whitney. Tragically, a third woman has now been attacked, but Jeff has disappeared, and investigators fear he may strike again.
When I heard that he had taken off, I was worried about Paige.
The detectives told me they truly did not know where he had gone or what he knew. I told Detective Blank he would probably find Jeff in Iowa near his family.
As Paige predicted, a trace on Jeff's cell phone leads police to a motel in Iowa.
He had taken a bunch of over-the-counter sleeping pills. He tried to take his own life and then ended up in a hospital in Des Moines.
Jeff survives the suicide attempt, and he is taken into custody by local police.
We headed up there to Iowa to get Mr. Moreland's DNA. We drove all the way back from Iowa with it. We wanted to be sure he wasn't going to get out of custody or bond out or whatever. And then the next morning, we got the DNA results back. We told Paige that his DNA matched both crime scenes. Jeff is, in fact, involved in the murders of Kara Jo and Nina.
It just blows my mind. And it was beyond all comprehension to me. This was 2010 when he murdered my mother. And Jeff and I split up in 1987. I had no idea what Jeff would become. The last time I actually saw Jeff was in 1994. He told me then that he periodically would patrol up and down my mother's street just to make sure that everything was okay. And at the time I thought, oh, that's so sweet. But now looking back on it, I just don't know.
Jeff Moreland is charged with the murders of Kara Jo Roberts and Nina Whitney and the sexual assault of the third victim. Soon after laying charges, investigators learn about the source of Jeff's phony DNA.
We were contacted by Jeff Moreland's ex-wife, and Jeff Moreland had a daughter with this ex-wife, and that daughter was engaged to someone. And that guy said that Jeff had called him out of the blue, and Jeff told him that he needed a sample of his DNA for a paternity test because someone was accusing Jeff of being the father of a kid. And so he provided a DNA sample and gave it to Jeff Moreland.
Then, Jeff tricked the Grandview police sergeant with some sleight of hand.
So the sergeant provided us a formal statement where he said he wasn't able to see Moreland's hands at all times when Moreland was taking a sample of his DNA.
Jeff's attempted deception backfires, only giving prosecutors more evidence against him.
There's nothing for the defense to attack. There's nothing to be argued because the physical evidence was just overwhelming.
I think it also says a lot that Jeffrey Moreland had zero witnesses in his defense at the trial.
He got life without parole plus 50 years consecutive on Kara Roberts' homicide. And then he got 10 years for armed criminal action and 20 years for murder second on my mother's case to run concurrent.
With no trial testimony from Jeff, police and the victims' families are left to piece together exactly what happened to Nina Whitney and Kara Jo Roberts.
What we do know is that Jeff Moreland took Kara Jo's life. My personal opinion is he was driving by and saw her in the yard, and he was in that mode where he was hunting and decided that's his target.
After killing Kara Jo, it seems Jeff developed a taste for murder. He struck again 2 years later.
I believe the day that Nina was murdered, Jeff Moreland simply knocked on the door and Nina saw who it was and let him in the house. It's not necessarily uncommon for a predator to go after older women because they feel like they are easier victims.
Of course, my mother would let him in. And then at some point, he had to have started forcing her backwards up the stairs. I think when he got her into her bedroom, that he tried to rip her shirt off of her, forced her onto the bed, but she did fight back. She did run. My mother went running down the stairs. He chased her. He stabbed her 24 times. The kill shot was here through the throat.
At some point, he turns on the water to try to maybe get her body up into the bathtub to wash off his DNA.
But at that point, he knew with his Parkinson's acting up that there was no way he was going to be able to take her body back up 2 flights of stairs and put her in a bathtub. And then he went upstairs to clean the knife off, put the knife in the kitchen drawer, and went out through the sliding glass door.
Investigators believe that before he left, Moreland stole Nina's cell phone to throw police off his trail.
He has the presence of mind to grab that phone and throw that phone in the grass a quarter-mile away from Nina's house. He knows that the investigator is going to be caught up in that phone as sort of a way to lead us away from him.
I did not know for 8 months who murdered my mother. The 8 months that I spent not knowing made me insane.
When you have families that do their investigations, sometimes it's not the best. But Paige being involved was actually good in this case because she was actually the person that found Jeff Moreland.
I can't even explain to you how grateful I am. Between my mother's neighbor and the sketch artist, I would have never figured it out. Never would have figured it out if it hadn't been for the two of them.
To call this an unexpected killer is almost an understatement. Jeff Moreland terrorized an entire community.
Police speculate that Jeff's forced retirement a few years before the murders may have been the catalyst that set him on the path to kill.
I feel that when he developed Parkinson's and he had his power taken away from him as a police officer, the murders were almost like him getting revenge on the world.
I joined this organization called Parents of Murdered Children and Other Survivors of Homicide Victims. And we're all basically going through the same thing. So it does help to have someone who understands the enormity of what has happened.
I think Nina would want to be remembered as a strong, independent woman who fought to the end. And that's how I'll always remember her.
There are frogs in the stores everywhere. You can't go anywhere without seeing cute little frogs somewhere. I think about my mother all the time when I see things that I know that she would appreciate, or when I hear country music. I think about her a lot.